so much for coming through. We're just really are just going to talk. There's a few questions that I want to ask, but effectively, it's just talking through all the different aspects and elements of what it means to have a baby early, because 7 years later, I still meet a lot of people who are shook and don't quite understand, or they've never heard or never met anyone who's had a prem baby until it's actually happened to them. And in support of Life's Little Treasures Walk for Prems this year, I thought I might, make a little bit of contribution myself, as well as then October, the whole month of October is International Mental Health Month. So hopefully what we're going to talk about today is going to be of some use to someone. But before we get to the nitty-gritties, I wanted, maybe you could start by, because I know you very well and I don't want to make a lot of assumptions, I wanted you to just spend a little bit of time telling us about yourself. How is it that you chose this as a career path, and where you work and exactly what it is that you do?
Right. So I'm Carl Kuschel. I'm the Medical Director of Neonatal Services at the Women's, where I've been for almost 13 years. Prior to that, I was working in New Zealand and Canada and Sydney. So I've been qualified for just over 30 years, which is a bit horrifying to actually say that out loud. But I pretty much chose pediatrics close to my final year of medical school because I liked working with children. They're the most innocent. And probably the revelation for me was doing a ward round in an adult ward, and then just realizing that the consultant was just talking to people about lifestyle things that they needed to do to stay healthy, lose weight, stop smoking, eat more healthily, less fat, exercise more. And I just thought, I can't do this for the rest of my life, tell people to change things when they won't do it. So then pediatrics sort of appealed to me quite a lot because they're innocent. And then I suppose if you're looking within that sort of setting, neonates are about as innocent as you get. So, and I didn't like it when I first started doing neonates because I was just totally out of my depth. There were these very small babies. They didn't interact with you. You had very stressed parents. And from a perspective of a doctor, the things that we often focus on is the procedural skills, the putting the drips in and the tubes and things, and that was more difficult. So once I sort of got my head around that a little bit and then saw past the things that were stressing me out, realizing this is it's an opportunity to look after a baby and a family for a long period of time. It's an area ripe for research because the families are and babies are with you for so long. And it's incredibly rewarding because as stressful as it is at times for us and for families, most babies are going to get through and live a very healthy, fulfilled life with their families. So it's a very sort of positive area to work in. It's not for everybody, but I've enjoyed it a lot. So that's pretty much how I ended up in the area. I had a couple of very supportive mentors as well who said that they thought it was a good area for me to work in, and I haven't regretted it at all. I've done other things and within my career, moved sideways at times and got other projects, but I've always missed the babies if I haven't looked after them for too long.
That's beautiful. Okay, what is defined as a premature birth?
Right. So term is anything from 37 weeks or more. So even up to 36 plus 6, that's prematurity. And we tend to divide it into big groups that just help us identify what the issues are. So if we're thinking about extreme prematurity, that's pretty much babies less than 28 weeks. Mm-hmm. Currently, most hospitals in Australia provide care to babies as early as 23 weeks. Some hospitals are starting to move down towards 22 weeks, but that's a new frontier for a lot of places. Then we have a big group of babies that are born between 28 weeks and 31 plus 6 weeks, and so they're sort of moderately preterm babies. And then you've got the babies who are late preterm, so that's 32 weeks to 36 weeks plus 6 days. And they make up about 8 to 9% of the population of babies born. So it's a substantial proportion. But if you're looking at the smallest babies, which are the ones that get the most attention and have the most problems, then you're talking about 1% of babies being down around the 27-week mark, which is about a kilo. Average at 27 weeks is a kilo. So around 1% of babies are earlier than that.
Okay.
And if you're getting down to the 23-week mark, you're talking about 0.5% to 1% of babies.
Okay. And what causes premature births? Is it?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It sort of depends a little bit on where you're born in terms of where in that gestation spectrum you're born. So a lot of the late preterm babies are born not because the mother's in labour or because the baby urgently needs to come, but it might be because there's a complication in a twin pregnancy, or the baby's not growing quite so well, or the mother has an illness. So there's lots of factors. About half the time we don't know why babies come early. And then there are the other causes such as bleeding, growth restriction, where the baby's not growing very well, and the concern is that the baby is better off out than in. That's influenced by a lot of factors.
Yeah.
Maternal illness also impacts as well, and maternal age. So older mothers tend to have their babies earlier. Probably a combination of factors there, including maternal illness. So there's lots of things. And even the babies where the mother is in labour or has a shortened cervix or something else that's going to put them at risk, we don't really know why that happens. We assume that it's infection, that there's something different about the environment that the cervix and the uterus are in that prompts the woman to go into labour, but most often we don't have a good reason. So
yeah. Does this mean that then there's no prevention effectively there's no way that a woman could actually prevent herself from ending up giving birth to a prem baby?
Yeah, for some women who've had a preterm baby, we would say, well, it's just sort of bad luck. So, for example, you could have had a bleed in your pregnancy that resulted in going into labour or distress to the baby that meant they need to be delivered. Yeah. And some of those things are a little less likely to happen again. If it's something like high blood pressure, so preeclampsia, then that is generally more common in first pregnancies, but can happen in second pregnancies. If it's an abnormality with the baby, so the baby's got a congenital abnormality that predisposes it, it's unlikely to happen again in a subsequent pregnancy, unless that same abnormality occurs and predisposes to preterm birth. Twins, if you have twins, and generally twins will come early, then if that's the only reason they came early, it's a bit unlikely to happen again. It's not impossible. I do remember telling one family a number of years ago that their very complicated course with their twins was very unlikely to happen again, and then they presented again with spontaneous twins another year or so later, and had a very similar course and was told off for saying it was unlikely to happen again. So you can't really predict the future. There are some things people can do to reduce the risk of preterm birth. One is smoking. So if we know that women smoke, then we'll generally encourage them to stop through the pregnancy. Okay. And then if they're identified at being at high risk, then a lot of the focus is around surveillance and trying to look for things that might tell the obstetric staff that it's more likely that the woman's going to need delivery, and so that we can adequately prepare the baby for that with steroids and magnesium sulfate and the other things that we try and do to optimise the baby's chances.
Okay. Oh, all right. Well, I wanted to now go through, I remember the first time we had our interaction with a doctor when Zizi was born, and it was quite confronting, and the information was a lot to take in, and then the ability to process the information, understand the information, and feel that in that moment you are making the most informed decision. And fortunately for us in our relationship, we have a overly geeky one of us person, which happens to be Nick, and thrives on numbers, and therefore his ability to have fully understood what was shared with us and relate that to me still smart person, but just understanding slightly differently to the way he does. I wanna understand what is the best way, one, for people to fully engage with the statistics of what it therefore means when you find yourself in that situation, either prior or in that moment, to fully understand what it really means, so that as people begin to make decisions, I don't know if I'm making any sense, as they begin to make decisions, they feel that the statistics that they are given or that they come across, in the end, I did one of the worst things, which is Google everything. And that kind of makes things worse. But fortunately for me, it enabled me to understand a bit more. It enabled me to see the images a bit more, so that then when Zizi came, it wasn't as confronting, I suppose, as it would have been if I had never even seen an image of what a tiny, tiny baby looks like. So in your, I suppose the big question then in your view is, how can people, regardless of their level of education, how can they begin to engage with the reality of having a prem baby, and the statistics that surround that, and with what's going to happen?
There's a lot in there to unpack, Dawn, so let's just work through it, a few things. Yeah, look, it's a really challenging time when families are either they've just had a preterm baby, or they've been told that they're likely to have a preterm baby, because all their hopes and dreams and expectations run out the door. So part of there's this, a lot of families are in denial. They're just not ready to accept that things have taken a different course than they'd anticipated. Sometimes they've had forewarning that things aren't going well, but it still shocks them when it happens. And every family's different, so the approach that you might take will depend a lot on what you get back from that family in that first meeting, and trying to get an understanding of what their capacity to take information in is, and what their capacity to process it is, and what their previous experience is. So it'd be fair to say that over the last 30 years, my style of talking to families has changed a lot, and we don't always get it right, because we're dealing with people, and it's depends on what sort of day I'm having, what sort of day they're having, what I already know about it. So I think it's one of the most challenging conversations. What I would hope is along the way there is some congratulation or celebration that they've had a baby, if that's when you first meet families. Won't always feel like that, but I think it's important to acknowledge that that's usually an experience that brings some joy, even if that's interspersed with some fear. And then depending on the situation, some people are very keen on maths and numbers. Personally, I like numbers, but when you're dealing with a human being in a family, then you've got to make those numbers meaningful. And so even the phrasing of how we will talk about things has a big impact. So if I say there's a 90% chance your baby will die, then that may give a different message than if I say there's a 10% chance your baby will survive. So those words of optimism and hope can be pretty important. So when you're communicating with families under pressure, and we're often under pressure and a bit of stress when we have to break bad news or have those difficult conversations, you're really hoping that everybody's got the capacity to be honest and to listen and to understand what the concerns are. And I've changed a lot in terms of depending on at what stage I'm talking to families. But if I'm going to talk to a family who are having a very early baby, probably that first meeting's not a time to talk about whether they're going to have retinopathy of prematurity examinations, and whether they might get chronic lung disease, and whether they might have problems at school with how they process information. I'm probably going to talk about the big stuff, like we're worried about your baby, or your baby's got say, for example, a 50% chance of surviving. And these are the immediate things that we're going to be dealing with, because a lot of us, some people want all that whole end-to-end information in one hit, but most families will get overwhelmed, and it becomes a bit it just becomes a bit robotic if we're running off a run sheet, and just basically saying, then they're going to have this, and then you might have this, and then you might have this, and no one ever takes it in. So I think certainly at the Women's, we've had quite a lot of change in the way we've presented information to families. And 10 years ago, it was probably around, in fact, probably until about 2 or 3 years ago, we had these very complicated sheets that listed percentages to the nearest 1%. It's too precise. So I must admit, I tend to use general terms. And when you're talking about probabilities of something happening, they either happen or they don't. So for this particular baby, it's either going to be 100% chance that that event occurs, or it won't. What we can say is that for 100 babies, then perhaps 50 of them will have that happen to them and 50 won't. But these numbers are all, if it's 40 and 60, does that make a difference? And if it's 35 and 65,
right.
And the numbers change as well. So I think that's the other thing we're realizing, is that when we talk to families very early on and we give them these numbers, then depending on what happens with their babies, we should be revising those numbers and
as you go on.
As you go along, and quite often realizing that families hear the first conversation you had with them, and if that was at 23 weeks, then they have their baby at 26 weeks, they're still carrying a lot of that information at 23 weeks, even though at 26 weeks things are quite different. And then if their baby's a week old, having been born at 26 weeks, then the figures are different again. And so I think we are getting better at revising those, and because generally speaking, as time goes by, the numbers get better. So those are sorts of challenges we have. I do remember when I was working in Canada, we had a tutorial where a family, a woman who had preterm babies in the hospital I worked at, came and talked to us, and she just acknowledged how challenging it was to get that information right every time. And you meet so many people, and they will say similar things that are different, and they can come across as being optimistic or pessimistic. They can use very similar numbers, and then that just confuses people. So we try and keep our communication very consistent.
Yeah.
And knowing what's important for the families influences a lot the way that we phrase things or use the words that we use.
Yeah.
And we don't always get it right. So.
Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah. And I suppose you're absolutely right. It varies for each family too, in terms of what you need, because I know that Nick wanted the full picture so that he could in his head kind of go through each nut and bolt, whereas for me, I just wanted the here and now. Right now, what are we today, what are we dealing with, what are we coping with, what are we going to do about it, what are our options for today, and then tomorrow will kind of take care of itself. And I think one of the things that I'm still grateful for is with all the different challenges that we brought to the space, it was always so beautiful to feel that the team was able to provide for Nick what he needed, and it was presented in the way that he needed to. But simultaneously, there were moments where there was room for me to say, this is too much. Can you just, I remember I used to say, can you just break it down? Can you just simplify? What does that actually mean? And as busy as the hospital is, it was always so good to know that time can be taken to ensure that I understood exactly what was going on. Because I think the worst thing is to feel outside, and I suppose to feel outside of the world that you are in at the moment. So because women are already feeling so helpless and so lost, and this deep sense of being robbed from what was supposed to be, and to add on top of that, to then completely feel alienated based on information that you don't understand, will be even more challenging. On a general space, if there's a woman who's listening now and she has obviously been seeing her OB and she's now aware that the likelihood is that she will be giving birth, and in this scenario it's not, it's probably going to be a good outcome, what would you say is the experience that she and her family can expect to experience from the hospital? And if there's absolutely anything she can start to do now in order to make that less horrifying, like what, like I mentioned earlier that I, for example, Googled pictures, which is horrid. What are some things that she can start doing now in order, when the time comes for her birth, to be less traumatic?
Okay, I haven't lived that, so I'm not sure I can say. What we have seen some families respond to is a virtual tour or a tour of the NICU. So if we know for sure that their baby's going to be coming, then what we used to do before COVID was get the families down, show them around, try and show them a similar sized baby. So at least the shock of seeing their own baby being that small, an incubator on a ventilator is less. And most families seem to appreciate that opportunity. With COVID, things have been a bit more challenging, and we can do some of those things remotely. But it's been it would be fair to say that COVID has caused has made it more difficult to provide the sort of care that we know families need, because there have been limitations on visitors, limitations on staff, difficulties in getting people into a room without there being concerns around social distancing. So I think we're living in some times at the moment that make it particularly difficult for families who have had a baby to really feel connected to their baby and probably to the staff caring for their babies as well. So I think we're hoping this will normalise at some stage, but we've got a little way to go. It's always, look, everybody's different. So I've seen some women who have just been very, very stressed about the fact that they may be having a baby early, and a lot of those women have got a history of anxiety or depression, and this is just a trigger that sets it off, and we know that that's not good for their baby. At the same time, if they're going to have a baby that's coming early, you sort of have to face the reality of that and try and figure out what works well for you. So I think when I see families that are extremely anxious before the birth, that worries me, and it would be my approach to try and talk to them about what they're most worried about and identify what have they actually got control over. Again, it's control over their own well-being, control over their nutrition, control over the family support and someone looking after the children, because parenting is all about loss of control, and having a very early baby just exaggerates that. So I think a lot of the time when we identify families who are very worried, there's often a history that they've been people that have had a tendency to worry more. We all worry. Worry is really just being concerned about something that you haven't got a lot of control over. So mostly we would try and give some strategies to help with that. And then if possible, we'll try and get our social workers who are very experienced in counselling and know what families have been through to try and get some supports in to help. So there are lots of supports. There's obviously Life's Little Treasures, make a little plug for them, but the staff themselves know, they can usually spot the red flags where they can identify that families might need a bit more help. Dads particularly, I've got to get onto that at some stage around supporting dads, but that's an area that we weren't very good at until 6 or 7 years ago, and again we're having difficulties because of COVID, but it's much more in our awareness that dads cope. And a lot of dads will cope by wanting the numbers and wanting to focus on all the graphs and the statistics and the monitors. And for some dads, that's a coping mechanism because they don't want to attach. They're worried about attaching to their baby and then losing their baby. And so it's much easier to be objective and look at the numbers. So I'm not thinking about Nick particularly because I know he's very attached to Zeke. But at the same time, when the dads are focusing on the numbers, we just try and remind them there's actually a little human being inside that incubator. And so you need to be connecting with that and not worrying so much about the numbers. So I think everybody copes differently, and we see some common patterns where we know there are some strategies we can help families with. Everyone's going to work through it at their own pace. Mums and dads work through it. There are different issues at different speeds. It's often very stressful. So there's no recipe that works for everybody. And people have to have some insight and awareness of what their own stressors and triggers are. So it's a long-winded answer to say, I don't know, but we do our best. So.
No, that's pretty good. Actually, it leads perfectly into my next question. I wanted to ask, I suppose it matters now more than anything because of COVID. What are the different ways, now baby's born and baby's in hospital, what are the different ways that parents, both mum and dad, can still be creating and making connections to baby? Kangaroo cuddles are still, I'm assuming, being offered to mums and dads.
Yeah, so we know that's one of the most important things that families can do, and it's important for both parents, not just mums. Dads often will pass the first kangaroo care off to the mums, but actually dads are usually better placed to do it in the first day or two anyway. So kangaroo care, very, very important. Skin-to-skin contact is very good for the babies, as terrifying as that may be for families initially, but it's also very good for the parent. And almost universally in the dads groups that we were running before COVID, we would hear about how relaxing it was. And if we had a dad in the group who was scared of it, the other dads would usually berate them and say, you need to go and do kangaroo care. So I think we're all believers that that's a wonderful thing. And for mums, obviously it's important for attachment as well as supporting breastfeeding and milk supply. So there are lots of reasons to do that. So that hasn't changed. But probably one of the big challenges for COVID at the moment is that the extended family can't visit, and that's where a lot of families get their support from. And I think it's really difficult when you've had a baby and you can't share that with other people.
Yeah.
Yes, you can use social media and you can use FaceTime and Zoom and WebEx and all the rest of it, and we can support that and facilitate that, which is great, but it's not the same, but it's better than nothing. So if I think back to even 10 years ago, mum would have a baby, would come to the NICU, we'd take a photo, we'd hand it to the dad, we'd send the dad back to show the photo to the mother. At least now we can connect through video means and a bit of two-way interaction. So I think that's technology has supported that, but ideally we'd want the mum and the baby together. So I think COVID, fewer cases today, which is great. Anyone who thinks it's a hoax is severely deluded, but it's going to take us a while to get back to normal, and whether normal ever looks like it was, we can't say yet. But we're very aware, and it's been very distressing for staff not to be able to provide that sort of support we would expect to families, particularly those where their baby's incredibly ill, or Gary's just sneaking past. So where the baby's been incredibly ill, and normally you would have a lot of family there supporting the parents through conversations, through interacting with their baby, through making memories. So I think that's been something that we've all really, really struggled with. And as hard as it is for us, for people who have actually looked after, for the staff and who have looked after adult patients with COVID, we've not been anywhere near as affected as some of those others. So as difficult as it is, it would be worse if you're an adult with COVID in an intensive care unit than it would be, at least your baby's got your parents there.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to press on that same question. So one of the things, remember, Nick and I started doing, I think because some of the ideas, when you are in the midst of the hot pressure situation, some things that seem quite simple and practical kind of disappear in the moment. But I'm trying to find practical things that parents now going through it can actually do. And then I'm going to just talk through some examples, and then you can let me know if those kind of work because of COVID. So things like, remember, Nick, we used to read stories to the baby. We used to sing to Ndalo. We used to insist on being a part of her cares. We used to insist, So even in the midst of the limitations that have been brought on by COVID, what kind of ideas or what research has come out to show that participating and engaging with your little bub in this way is actually both helpful for baby as much as it is helpful for mum and dad? So I'm trying just to find those, that silver lining to say, yes, everything is upside down, but in this moment, here are some practical things that you can do that further create a bond between yourself and the baby.
Yeah, look, I think reading's a really good option, particularly for dads, because they often feel a little bit more disconnected. They're not providing breast milk, but they're usually getting a little less skin to skin. They're often not there through the day. So we, at the Women's, we have a library, which was actually started by you and Nick, as with the donation of books, and we've since had a whole lot more. So I think, reading's a really good way. We know that the baby will recognise smells and voices. doesn't matter what words you say, it's more the tone that you use them in. We have had one dad who was studying for an exam who was reading his economics textbook to his baby. His baby didn't mind, and he got through it. But I think it also, for those of us that have looked after babies for a long time, I've got no problem having a conversation with the baby that I might be examining or having a look at. I don't care who's in the room. I'm not self-conscious at all. But for a lot of men particularly, they struggle to talk to their baby. They're worried someone will hear and it'll show some vulnerability and they don't know what to say. So reading a book's a really good way to take that away. Music, absolutely. We encourage people to sing if they want to. We might dictate their choice of music at times, but it's got to be quiet. No headphones for the babies because we don't want to overstimulate them. But I think music's, it relaxes everybody. One thing I will say is skin to skin, particularly. One of the things I've noticed continually is that when through the years is that when parents are having skin to skin with their baby, there is almost a hush in the room. There's a real respect that this is a private moment. So when the curtains are drawn and we know that there's a family and they're doing skin to skin, it's amazing the impact that has on what else goes on in the room. Whereas if there's no skin to skin, then there's generally sort of more noise and activity and hustle and bustle. So I think there's that sort of respect that this is the parents' time. Other things that you can do is bring clothing from home and things that have a personal meaning. There are some studies looking at smells and tastes and other things to try and improve that attachment. I don't think that we've got definite answers on that yet. Of course, infection prevention control is now going to be, it's always been important, but I think now with COVID, it'll be just so much more important that some of the things that maybe we used to do will be more challenging to do. But yeah, and of course, just being there is really critical. And I think often families feel like they're sitting there and in the way, or they don't know what they're doing. We have some families where it's pretty obvious that they do need to spend some time away from their baby. But I think in general, we'd rather see people and know that they're there and engaged and doing. I didn't mention nappy changes and feeds and baths because that's just routine for us to get the parents good at that. But it's all important way for you to know your baby so that at the time you take your baby home, you know the baby better than anybody else. And that's the key transition. One other thing I will just comment on is we're focusing on their attachment with baby, but you've got to keep your relationship going as well. And that's an area that certainly in our dads group, when we're talking to dads, we will often focus on is that you can't just be here with your baby all the time. You've got to maintain what's going on at home. You're going to have your conversation with your partners. In the old days, you could go out for dinner, and there's quite a few families where you give them advice. The dads will be running around like mad things. Take some time out. Take your partner out for a meal. Sit down, talk about whatever you need to talk about. That self-care is important.
Yeah. If I may add on a couple of things that I know worked really well for us. The first one was establishing a great relationship with the staff, because within reason, the staff, the nurses, the staff rotation within a cycle, we consistently had the same people. And that was, I know that for me, when I left in the evenings, the anxiety was significantly reduced, because I knew that people who really cared for her, were with her, and I knew that they had understood me and my personality and what would give me peace. And so it was crazy. Is it 10 o'clock? I'd get a call like at 10. They knew that I went to bed at 10, and someone would call me at 10, because what I started doing is before going to bed, I'd call the hospital to say, I'm going to bed now. I just want to know that she's okay before I go to sleep. And if 10 o'clock hit and I hadn't rung the hospital, the nurse looking after Zizi would actually call me to say, we've been waiting for you to call us. Since you haven't called, we just wanted you to go to bed and know that she's okay. So I felt that really establishing a really good relationship with the staff was quite helpful for me. It also made me trust them a bit more, because I kind of started feeling that they really had her interest at heart, and they held her within reason as closely as I could, to my own heart. Yeah, and I'm trying to think what else was really well. It at first it seemed insignificant, but over time, when I look at the pictures now, it's one of the things that I love the most. The little space that we had, and it was fortunate because we had our little corner, best as we can and within the limitations of what the hospital was able to allow us to do. Remember, I turned that into a smaller version of a nursery. I was quite obsessive about the space and her environment, and that probably had more to do with me and what that emotionally and mentally made me feel, to think that it wasn't so sterile, it wasn't just a hospital space only. So that was quite helpful for me. And I was able, I don't know if it was allowed, but the nurses allowed me at times to bring like a blanket for her from home, so that even then her incubator was a bit more personal. And so all the things that I'd lost out on being able to do at home, a very small portion of those I was able to actually duplicate within the hospital space, and there was some level of negotiation. So I'd add to say, to advocate for oneself and for the baby, and to see within the structures that exist what will be allowed in order for you to feel that, yeah, exactly what you're saying, somehow in the midst of the madness, life is still moving on, and you can create, I don't know, man, you can bring sanity into this insane whirlwind that you're going through. And it might seem very small and insignificant, but I just know that we had all her books, and we'd put them up, and I brought some teddies that would fully sterilize. Now, again, it might be different because of COVID, but we'd found a way to actually create her space to look best as we can within the space. So those are the two things that I wanted to add from my side. Now, the hard heart bit, as we start to conclude, talking through babies that do then pass on, and how do I want to ask this question? I suppose letting go of babies and accepting and understanding that from a medical perspective, all that could possibly be done has been done, and that at a certain point it's actually in the baby's best interest to not continue pursuing medical support. I'm not probably phrasing it properly on a medical science way, but I'm just speaking, which is for us that time when we knew that trying to preserve her life and trying to keep her going was no longer something that would be in her best interest. And I know that we had chatted about, asking the support and this assistance when that line was becoming much, much more clear that there really wouldn't be anything medically that could be done for her. It was a very challenging and confronting space, because all the desires, and for us as people of faith, all the hope that we'd had for her, and all the prayers, it was really probably more than anything else for me. That was the one thing that was the most hard to accept, that, either on a spiritual level, the miracle wouldn't happen, or on a medical level, that there was no science left that could assist her. And even though I've asked this question earlier on, when or what time or how can parents get to that space where they genuinely, as hard as it is, and I know from experience how hard it is to accept that there is now no longer anything that can be done for baby, and that in this moment the best thing to do for the baby is to let baby go. What approach does the hospital use? What conversations can be had? How do parents really get to that space of, because I think at the end, is it right that at the end of the day they still need to therefore make the call or the decision that this is it?
Yeah, so I'll start with the last one, because that's probably the easiest bit. So generally speaking, yeah, we would prefer that if a baby isn't going to survive, that it's a decision made with the parents, with their agreement, with the information that we provided, that gives us the best indicator that that's going to be the case. We're not always right. Look, we don't like being called, that we're behaving like God and deciding, but we do look at the science and try and look at our previous experience and understand where the family's at. Occasionally, very occasionally, we will have a family where it's pretty clear that the baby isn't going to survive, and the family are not ever going to say that they would be happy for us to stop. And that's really challenging for the family, and it's really challenging because they feel like they're being told that we don't have any more faith or hope that their baby will get through. It's very difficult for staff because we're trying to be as honest as we can, and for religious or personal or experience or whatever reason, if a family aren't necessarily taking on board what you're saying or acknowledging it, I think a lot of families take it on board, they just don't want to hear it, and so that's challenging conversation. And it makes it quite challenging for the staff looking after the baby who may be in quite a lot of discomfort or distress or pain. Well, we can manage those things, but it's not necessarily the right thing. So that's a very rare thing, but when we do that, we have a little process for how we try and work that through with families. And it can be a long, protracted process. Most often, it just becomes clearer over time that the baby's not following the course that we would want, and that just things are stacked up. And by the time you're certain a baby's not going to survive, then there's probably not very much time left, and it's pretty obvious. So sometimes those discussions, as they're heading that way, we just start to lay the groundwork so the family have a bit of a chance to think about what's important for them, what does this mean, what are the implications, how am I going to cope, what supports am I going to need, what information do I need. Because in the end, if we as clinical staff come to a family and tell you that your baby's not going to survive, then the likelihood is your baby's not going to survive. So they're never easy conversations for anybody, and I have read your book and bits of Nick's book where you cover off this, and almost record in horror as you've recounted some of the words that I used, and I was probably pretty blunt because sometimes that's the only way you can get the message over. But you've got to be clear, and you've got to be empathetic, and you've got to listen. And then you still have to make a decision at that point. So, it's never easy. So, as difficult as it may be for clinical staff to have those conversations, it's much worse for the families on the receiving end. So we do, they're not easy conversations. To be fair, they're easier conversations than if a baby suddenly becomes acutely unwell and it's pretty clear that at short notice they're not going to survive because they've got an infection or necrotizing enterocolitis or something else, because then there's no preparation and there isn't a chance to really work the family through it. So, but everybody views these differently, and often the mother and the father in a different place. If there's extended family, then they can be in a different place. Everybody brings their experience, their life experience to the room. And whatever you say, someone's had an experience that either will make them not believe us or will make them on side with us. So you never quite know how that's going to work out. But our job is to listen and to talk, facts, opinion. And for one of the things that I am pretty clear about is that I will differentiate between something that's a fact, versus something that I think versus something that I don't know, because then at least I'm being honest. So I can think as much as I like what might happen, but in the end I can't always predict. So I'm not really answering your question other than to acknowledge really just how difficult it is, and particularly when you've seen your baby rally and improve and then there's a setback, then that's crushes a lot of families. So all the hospitals have got lots of supports in place, whether it's the right support at the right time. Who knows? But most of us, we love our jobs, and when babies do die, it affects all of us. We don't always show it because that's not what we do, but we remember and we know what you've been through and what other families have been through. And sometimes it is a good thing because we can see the baby suffering, but other times it's really, really sad. So our job is to try and work everybody through it and support the staff, support the family, extended family, and make sure that the baby's comfortable.
Yeah. No, you are actually. I mean, you might not be answering it directly, but I think you are. You know, and like I was saying earlier, that making those connections and creating best as you can, that understanding with the hospital and the staff means that when you reach that point, it's that trust that I was talking about earlier, that at least you know that you wouldn't be asked or you wouldn't be engaged in this conversation unless it had come to that. Do you know what I mean? And I think that I know that for me personally, one of the things that did then make it easier was that I felt that I could trust the information, and I felt that I could trust the people delivering the information. And because I could trust that, I understood that everything that could possibly be done had already been done. But also I understood that, as kind of ironic as it is, not ironic is not the right word, as kind of as counter as it is, that at that point what mattered more was her rather than the science. And what mattered more was, is my baby suffering? Is this in the best interest, do you know what I mean, of the baby? And I think between those two things, that then they made it much easier to kind of acknowledge, because I don't think there's any parent who would directly want their baby to suffer. Do you know what I mean? Like at our core, we are mother tigers and would do everything to protect our cubs. And so I suppose back to the earlier thing I was saying about building those relationship within the staff and the hospital, that you really get to a space where you know that the hospital and the people looking after the baby, and indirectly you want the best for both the family and the baby. And if ever you find yourself in that situation, that you can rely back on that measure of believing and trusting that it wouldn't be an easy decision to be made first by staff before they even present it to you. And I appreciate it also. I think I remember that the staff themselves had the conversations amongst yourself, and had presented the different scenarios. Do you know what I mean? So when it came to us, it is because there was a unanimous agreement that actually, this we've come to the end of the road, which also made it as tough as it was, semi-doable to go, okay, you know, if this is what it is, then, you know, we're just going to have to go with it and believe that for us, if God wants to then move forward, we will get that. And if that doesn't happen, then this was supposed to be the path. And I think one of the things now in hindsight I appreciate more, again, touching back on what we were talking about earlier, is then having, made those spaces, made those connections with her, whether it was singing, whether it was reading, and do you know what I mean? So then it gave me something, it gave me a sense of takeaway, even though there was still a loss. And so I think if anyone is finding themselves in that situation at the moment, it sucks horribly. It sucks horribly, and there's nothing that anyone could ever actually say in that moment to make it better. But I think that some of the things we've touched on about creating the connections, about understanding the information, I would really be encouraging people to start doing some of that journey in order for this season or that moment to be made a little bit easier. Okay, well, not all babies die.
No, most get through.
Actually get through, and they get to be really good babies. We across Aziz's bed, they was Bangladesh family who had a baby much at a different gestation than us, and we created the relationship. And she's 7 because she was born obviously in the same year as Izzy, and she's grown to be a really bubbly, beautiful baby, which, you know, some people go, oh, wouldn't that trigger you? And I'm like, oh, no, it enables me to celebrate her journey. And it kind of helps me to see what a 7-year-old would look like anyway. But I love that this child has had close to no impact of surviving prem babies. Can you share just 1 or 2 great stories about what life after leaving the hospital, life after surviving prematurity looks like?
Well, there are so many good stories. It's pretty hard to. Well, so we follow the kids up sort of routinely. The small babies under 28 weeks, we see them till about the age of 2, and almost all of those we will be saying at the age of 2, things look fine. You don't need a pediatrician. Off you go. You may have your child doing pretty well, may have some problems at school. Important to mention prematurity, but we wouldn't anticipate anything definite. So that's by far and above the most common scenario we have when we see babies in outpatient clinics. Now that's slightly modified by the fact that if we know there's going to be a major problem, we tend not to follow them. We tend to divert them to the services that are going to provide better ongoing care. But this is the vast majority. I have some personal experience with some 2 women who are now in their 20s who I looked after in Auckland. And one is the daughter of extremely good friends of ours. They were friends of ours before they had her, and I was actually a junior doctor working in the hospital when they had Eva. And she is, well, was she born? I've got to try and remember now. She's be 24 now. And she had her share of problems. She's a teacher. She's a very active sports person. She's not short, which is good because often they are. And she's absolutely fine. So for children for adults who are preterm, they don't know their preterm. They don't remember the experience. They don't remember how stressful it was for their parents. We've had adolescent people talk at some of our research days where they just sort of said, well, we're just who we are. So I think, there are probably some effects, which I'll mention in a moment, long-term for preterm children that we're still interested in. But as far as they're concerned, when they become adults, they're just who they are. Much the same as any life experience you've been through, or adverse circumstances or privilege or whatever else makes you who you are. Prematurity is just part of that. And probably what is more important, what happens when you're preterm in the hospital in terms of your lungs and whether you've had any bleeding in your brain and whether you've had infections and other complications, sets you up a little bit for your potential. But what actually is most important is what happens to you once you leave, and the environment that you go into, and how your parents provide for you and provide you love, and you've got a supportive environment, and then what happens. So, and the older you get, then the less important that 3-month block you're in the hospital becomes. For some babies, it's been incredibly important for them because they've had major complications. But for others, it's just a phase of their life that the older they get, the smaller it is. Now, for the parents, it can be a different story because it haunts a lot of parents. And again, I have a very good friend who I looked after her 24-weeker Harry. Probably he's about 20 now. Might be 21, and he had a share of problems, and his mother is a business partner of a dear friend of mine. So I seem to be the common theme for people having preterm babies. I don't quite know why that is. But actually his mother, one of the things that happened in my old hospital was that we had in New Zealand we had posters in the hallway where parents would write a story about what happened to their baby, and they would usually show photos and write stories in their own words about what had happened. And Lucy, so Harry's mum, finally did that when Harry turned 18.
Wow.
So she finally, if you like, and she used to, I did actually, it was probably a little bit after I said to her one time, you really need to let this prematurity thing, you need to let go of it. Because every time she'd say, he's doing very well considering his preterm. He's doing very well considering his preterm. And I just said, he's 18, for God's sake, you've just got to leave that behind. But for Lucy, it was such a big, important part of who Harry was and who she was. She's a therapist, actually, an occupational therapist. So she felt an enormous responsibility that Harry had to do well because that was her job.
Yeah.
She was a pediatric OT. And so it was after that, I think we'd had a bit too much to drink probably when I said that to her. But she then did this poster, and it was her catharsis to actually say, well, he's now 18. And she put it up. She went back to the neonatal unit and actually put it up on the wall 18 years down the line. So I think, for the children, that it means, I don't think it means anything to them. They don't remember the experience. But for the parents, it's life-changing. And that has an impact on themselves, sometimes career paths, relationships, how big their family's going to be, often relationships with parents and friends, who may or may not understand what they've been through. So you know, in some respects, the effects are far more widely reaching than just for the child. So, and everybody does it in their own time, at different pace, with different things that will trigger them or not trigger them. So, you know, we've learned a lot about realizing that this, you know, this is not something that's just a brief moment in your life. It's gonna stay with you for a while.
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah. Wow. All right. Well, last one, and then we're done. Is there anything you want parents to know? Is there a question I could have asked that I didn't ask? Is there something you really want to get out and share with people? Yeah, I'm just giving you an opportunity to have the final word, which, as you know, is very rare.
Oh, that's a really tough one. Look, I don't think there's anything I need to get out other than really to say that the people who look after babies, just we love babies, we love our jobs, we love doing it. Yeah, there are good days and bad days like every job, but mostly we're there because, you know, we love babies and we know that the vast majority are going to do very well, and they're going to move into a family that needs to be prepared to take them and have the skills to look after them. Parenthood generally is stressful, even if you have your babies on time.
Yeah.
But if you have them early, it just adds another layer. So I think, you know, listen, you know, if the staff are asking you questions, they're coming from a good place. If they tell you that you need a break from your baby, they're telling you that because they're worried about you. But I think as time's gone by, we're probably much better now at having those conversations with families. It's a very different world than it was when I did 30 years ago, to be honest. You know, just the parental involvement, what we know has grown a lot more. COVID's a setback, but we'll probably get back there eventually. But I think, you know, everyone's there to make sure that your baby has the best possible chance and the best possible environment.
Yeah.
So, you know, just ask for help. It's okay to ask for help.
That's right. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for now. Thank you for the past. Thank you for everything we've been through.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I really do hope this helps. You know, I always say to Nick, even if it helps one person, that's good enough. You know, and from what we've spoken about, I think we've covered a few good areas, and hopefully will be quite informative. So thanks again, Carl. Really appreciate you. Say hi to Kerry. I think she was going to walk one more time, so I can say hello. But send my love. Thank you again. Have a wonderful afternoon.